All right, we are going to read chapter 9 of Huck Finn. Please join me. I wanted to go and look at a place right about the middle of the island that I'd found when I was exploring. So we started and soon got to it because the island was only 3 miles long and a quarter of a mile wide. This place was a tolerable long steep hill or ridge, about 40 foot high. We had a rough time getting to the top, the sides were so steep and the bushes so thick. We tramped and clumb all around it, and by we found a good big cavern in the rock, most up to the top side toward Illinois. The cavern was as big as 2 or 3 rooms bunched together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. It was cool in there. Jim was putting our traps in there right away, but I said we didn't want to be climbing up and down there all the time. Jim said if we had the canoe hid in a good place that we'd have traps in the cavern, we could rush there if anybody was ever to come to the island, and they would never find us without dogs. And besides, he said that them little birds had said it was going to rain, and did I want the things to get wet? So we went back and we got the canoe and paddled abreast the cavern and lugged all the traps up there. And then we hunted in a place close by to the canoe amongst the thick willows. We took some of the fish off the lines to set them again and begun to get ready for dinner. The door of the cavern was big enough to roll a hogshead in, and on one side of the door the floor stuck out a little bit and was flat and good enough to build a fire on. So we built it there and we cooked dinner. We spread the blankets inside for a carpet and eat our dinner in there. We put all the things in handy at the back of the cavern. Pretty soon it darkened up and begun to thunder and lightning, so the birds was right about it. Directly it begun to rain, and it rained like all fury too, and I never did see the wind blow so. It was one of those regular summer storms. It would get so dark that it looked all blue-black outside and lovely, and the rain would thrash along so thick that the trees a little ways would look dim and spiderwebby. And here would come a blast of wind that would bend the trees down and turn up the pale undersides of leaves. And then a perfect ripper of a gust of wind would follow along and set the branches to toss in their arms if they were just wild. And next, when it was about the bluest and blackest, fist, it was this bright glory. You'd have to see a little glimpse of treetops a-plunging about, away off yonder in the storm, hundreds of yards further than you could see before. Dark as sin again in a second, and now you'd hear the thunder let go with an awful crash, and then go rumbling, grumbling, tumbling down the sky towards under the other side of the world, like rolling empty barrels down the stairs, where it's long stairs, and they bounce a good deal, you know. Jim, this is nice, I says. I wouldn't want to be nowhere else but here. Pass me along another hunk of fish and some hot cornbread. Well, you wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for Jim. You'd been down there in the woods without any dinner and getting most drowned too. That you would, honey. Chickens know when it's going to rain, and so did the birds, child. The river went on raising and raising for 10 or 12 days, till at last it was over the banks. The water was 3 or 4 foot deep on the island in low places in the Illinois bottom. On that side it was a good many miles wide, but on the Missouri side it was the same old distance across, a half a mile, because the Missouri shore was just a wall of high bluffs. Daytimes we paddled all over the island in the canoe. It was mighty cool and shady in the deep woods, even if the sun was blazing outside. We went winding in and amongst the trees, and sometimes the vines hung so thick we had to back away and go some other way. Well, on every old broken-down tree you could see rabbits and snakes and such things. And when the island had been overflowed a day or two, they got so tame on account of being hungry that you could paddle up. Pardon me. And you could paddle up and put your hand on them if you wanted to, but not the snakes and turtles. They would slide off in the water. The ridge our cavern was on was full of them. I could have had pets enough if I wanted them. One night we catched a little section of lumber raft, a nice pine planks. It was 12 foot wide and about 15 or 16 foot long, and the top stood above water 6 or 7 inches, a solid level floor. We could see saw logs go by in daylight sometimes, but we let them go. We didn't show ourselves in daylight. Another night, when we was up at the head of the island, just before daylight, here comes a frame house down on the west side. She was a 2-story and tilted over considerable. We paddled out and we got aboard, clumb in an upstairs window, but it was too dark to see yet, so we made the canoe fast and set it for wait for daylight. The light begun to come before we got to the foot of the island. Then we looked in the window. We could make out a bed and a table and 2 old chairs and lots of things around the floor. And there was clothes hanging on the wall. And there was something laying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man. So Jim says, "Hello, you." but it didn't budge. So I hollered again, and then Jim says, "The man ain't asleep. He's dead. You hold still. I'll go and see." He went and bent down and looked, and he says, "It's a dead man, yes indeedy. Naked too. He been shot in the back. I reckon he's been dead 2 or 3 days. Come in, Huck, but don't look at his face. It's too ghastly." I didn't look at him at all. Jim throwed some old rags over him, but he didn't need it, or needn't done it. I didn't want to see him. There were heaps of old greasy cards scattered around the old floor, and the old whiskey bottles, and a couple of masks made out of black cloth, and all over the walls was the ignorantest kind of words and pictures made with charcoal. There was 2 old dirty calico dresses, and a sunbonnet, and some women's underclothes hanging against the wall, and some men's clothing too. We put the lot in the canoe. It might come good. There was a boy's old speckled straw hat on the floor, and I took that too. And there was a bottle that had some milk in it, and it had a rag stopper for a baby to suck. We would have took the bottle, but it was broke. There was a seedy old chest and an old hair trunk with the hinges broke. They stood open, but there warn't nothing left in them that was on any account. The way things was scattered about, we reckoned the people left in a hurry and warn't fixed so as to carry off most their stuff. We got an old tin lantern and a butcher knife without any handle, and a brand new Barlow knife worth 2 bits in any store, and a lot of tallow candles, and a tin candlestick, and a gourd, and a tin cup, and a ratty old bedquilt off the bed, and a reticule with needles and pins, and beeswax, and buttons, and thread, and all such a truck in it, and a hatchet, and some nails, and a fish line as thick as my little finger, with some monstrous hooks on it, and a roll of buckskin, and a leather dog collar, and a horseshoe, and some bottles of medicine that didn't have no label on them. And just as we was leaving, I found a tolerable good curry comb, and Jim found a pretty ratty old fiddle bow and a wooden leg. The straps was broke off it, but barring that, it was a good enough leg, though it was too long for me and not long enough for Jim, and we couldn't find the other one, though we hunted all around. And so, take it all around, we made a pretty good haul. When we was ready to shove off, we was a quarter mile below the island, pretty broad day. So I made Jim lay down in the canoe and cover up with a quilt, because if he sat up, people could tell he was a good ways off. I paddled over to the Illinois shore and drifted down a half a mile doing it. I crept up the dead water under the bank and had no accidents and didn't see nobody. We got home all safe. So for this chapter, guys, I want you to start thinking about what it is that Huck and Jim did discover on their little journey. What you make of Jim knowing that it was going to rain and what that says about his and perhaps even Huck's understanding of nature. And how it is that they survived this flood, right? They were housed up in a cavern and they made themselves a pretty nice little house. Well, what are they going to do with all of these belongings that they found in this old drift house or old frame house that's been drifting in the river? And what do you make about the dead body in there and Jim's willingness to protect Huck from seeing it? Or even more so at the end of the chapter, what do we make of Huck covering up Jim to keep him protected from being seen, since we now know that he's a runaway slave? There are a couple things that seem to happen in this chapter that indicate to us the relationship between Huck and Jim. I want you to spend some time with that before we get into chapter 10. I'll see you over there.